I'm now here to introduce the chair for the first panel. Jair Peltier is a PhD student in political science and international relations at USC, and he is a member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, where he's adjunct faculty at the local tribal community college, TMCC. Please.
All right. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry. All right. Okay. Bonjour Anin, Jair Peltier Indishnakas Makwadodemni now, Mekadakwaju Ndunjaba. My name is Jair Peltier. I'm from the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, the Bear Clan of the Anishinaabe people. I am a PhD student here at USC. I am in the Political Science and International Relations Department. My specific research is on indigenous sovereignty and tribal constitutions. And I'm also the graduate cultural ambassador for the Native American Pacifica Student Lounge for our indigenous students. And yeah, so we'll kick off the panel here. I'll first introduce Dr. Raymond Orr. He is an associate professor in the Department of Native American Indigenous Studies at Dartmouth. He is the author of Reservation Politics, Historical Trauma, Economic Development, and Intra-Tribal Politics. And by the way, the name of this panel is Legal and Theoretical Perspectives. And Professor Orr will be covering his research on comparative perspectives on early violence in settler societies, Australia, and the US.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and it's really, really great to be here. I mean, people say that creating a conference is something like a marathon, but I think the organizers just ran an ultra marathon since of 5 years. So it's great to be here in person, and I've really enjoyed the presentations thus far. So I'm going to talk today from a comparative perspective on the United States and Australia, but I'm going to do something a little bit different. And I'm not going to necessarily think about it as a way to lighten the mood, but talk actually about and focus on the death of settlers and the ability of indigenous populations to extract death from early colonists. Now, I've come to this kind of paper and this idea from a few experiences, and I'll return to the topic in a second or so, but wanted to kind of describe the origins of this. So as the scholar who introduced me, I'm also a political scientist, and we're very interested in a sense of warfare and the institutions that come from warfare. I'm citizen Potawatomi, and the Potawatomi people signed more treaties than any other group in North America. And the subject of this, and ultimately I'm going to try to explain the presence of treaty making. And then finally, I spent 6 years teaching Indigenous Australian politics and Indigenous politics comparatively at the University of Melbourne. And so part of this comes from the experience of working in Australia and thinking about some of the fundamental differences around the ways in which early colonization happened. There's a lot of great work about the similarities. So Lisa Ford's work would be someone I would recommend, but this is in essence thinking about there are some important differences and differences that political scientists and those who are looking historically about institutions, I don't think attend as much as they should. So I'm going to start with 3 assumptions from my field of kind of comparative institutionalism. And I'll describe a little bit about what that means in a second and give you an example. But there are 3 kind of starting points that this talk revolves around. The first one being that early colonial interactions are institutionally formative, that they matter a lot around land, around treaty, around institutional dynamics here. A second assumption is that violence and death in this early period is especially formative. right? That people respond generally with a desire to not die. And I'll give some examples of how political science attends this outside of indigenous studies, but I think is somewhat of a fair example or a fair assumption here. And then there's an assumption which I think is wrong from the perspective of those who are working in political science that say that the colonization compared to elsewhere, sub-Saharan Africa for instance, of what becomes this term Neo-Britons, which is kind of a terrible term, but it's the one that gets used in the literature. It's not my term here, that it was relatively easy, and there's a lot of commonality between Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. And I think this one is fundamentally wrong. Now, what I'd like to do with this talk is think about Indigenous Australian and US experiences and how we might actually learn something from this early formative experience, and there's some kind of validity there. But then also think about the ways in which violence and death are very different for settlers in these early periods across the United States and Australia. So in particular, I'm interested in the ways in which violence and death help us understand the presence of treaties and treaty making and the absence of treaty making. And I'll describe why a treaty is important in the next step here. So treaties with indigenous peoples are exceptionally important. This does not mean that they were honored, and their importance is not because necessarily they were honored, but they become an important institution for indigenous peoples in terms of self-governance or autonomy for a number of different reasons. They grant, or actually in a certain sense recognize, autonomy in a few different ways. So in the United States, treaties do a few different things. They establish boundaries and territory. They also, in some cases, might describe the type of resources that indigenous peoples who have signed this treaty with the settler state might have access to. They also identify the existence of an indigenous population as well, which is tremendously important because if you look at examples where there are not treaties, you actually have a lot of time that groups have to use to try to explain that they exist and they're of this particular region. In the US example, they established kind of the supremacy of the federal government and relating with tribes, something that's actually quite useful and beneficial as we've come to see. And they also might, in a certain sense, help us explain both the ways in which tribes have a special tax status, this kind of flows from point number 3, and regulatory status, which can have all kinds of benefits that we've seen in the last 25 years. And when we think about these treaties and the number of treaties with what we call Neo-Britons, this group, we have at least 300 treaties with the United States, 70 between First Nations peoples and Canada. We have 1 treaty in New Zealand, the Treaty of Waitangi, which covers the entire experience of the entire island. And then when we go to Australia, we have 0 treaties. And this is actually of supreme importance for how the political history of Indigenous Australians plays out for 150, 160 years. Now, real quick, if you're welcome to take notes, but I'd also be more than happy to send these slides to anyone later on if they want to take a break from that. Now, the argument that I'm going to make here, which I don't think is particularly unreasonable, and has been kind of hinted at in previous literature, but I don't think made explicit, is that treaties are solutions to early violence, or at least to violence, and become, in a certain way, even though overlooked, very important later on, even if they had been violated. And a second argument here I'm going to make is that there's a lot of difference in early violence between the United States and Australia. That this violence and the ability to extract death from settlers varies between these 2 different regions. So in terms of kind of colonial interactions as being institutionally formative, and by institution, boy, that's one of the most abused words of the social sciences in the last 50 or 100 years. But this idea is that an institution brokers agency with structure, that it's something that's hard to change and hard to get rid of. Often this is called a kind of comparative historical approach or institutional approach that I'm going to take. And I want to give a popular example just so we kind of have an idea of what I'm talking about here. And this is Jared Diamond's kind of Guns, Germs, and Steel, right? This idea that early interactions have a lot in terms of creating the outcomes. Now, his is a little bit different than the argument that I'm going to be making here, of course, but this idea that these primordial variables and these big differences come out to play structurally. So this is a popular example. Now, academically influential for my field is a paper that was published, 20 plus years ago by Robinson, which looks at the colonial origins of comparative development. Now, what this paper does, and it has no interest whatsoever in indigenous populations, and that's fine, we don't have to ask that they do this, but that what it tries to show is that if you look at the relationship between early settler death and economic development, that you see a pattern emerges. And that it actually explains, in a certain sense, the settler states that emerge versus maybe the more extractive states in terms of resources. So I'm gonna in the next slide, give you a bit of a figure, a chart here, and I'm gonna explain it, but please don't get automatically put off by it. So the acronyms are countries. And what I've done is this shows that there's a relationship between high settler death and low economic development. And then there's a relationship between high development, economic development, and low settler death. And the assumption here, or what they try to explain from this, is that settlers move to places where they are less likely to die. And they create, well, let's just use the term colonist because we're actually talking about a particular type of colonist being a settler. And they're not interested in moving to places where there are a tremendous amount of disease, right? Or they're likely to be killed. And what results from this is that they bring quote unquote institutions that may be extractive like private property, but there's a relationship between, later on between low death and high development. In places where settlers were likely to die, they brought as few settlers as possible, but they tried to extract the most either out of labor or out of resources. And so we have a grouping here of what we call Neo-Britons in the literature, and it's high development, low settler death. And what I want to say is actually this is not the case, at least in the United States, and we need to actually break this up. And it has actually a lot to do with indigenous politics and the presence perhaps of treaties. So the second argument that's within the ones that I outlined at the beginning is that, this is the argument they make. Low settler death, and there's more settlers, better institutions, so to speak. Forgive this better institutions in these air quotes here, but this grouping of all these states together. And they said that there's a certain parity between the US and Australia and early settler death, which I think is wrong. The major difference actually that if you look at the experience here of at least the first 20, 50 years is that indigenous induced settler death is much greater in the United States, what would become the United States. And the examples I'm going to give today is going to be the Virginia colony and that of New South Wales, the first colony in Australia. So I'll walk through a little bit of these early experiences and come back to this theory and why I think that we see these differences in death. So the first kind of British settlement in terms of permanent settlement attempt was at Roanoke Island, 1585. The British leave to go back to England, and they come back and it's vanished. Was it a hurricane? Was it lack of food? Was it annihilation from actually a nearby tribe? There seems to be evidence, or people seem to think it was annihilation, or the possibility, maybe optimistically, that those on Roanoke Island joined a nearby tribe. And the second one that had a longer kind of legs was Jamestown, 1607. And what Jamestown, its early interactions was a tremendous amount of conflict, and it arrived around the Powhatan Confederacy, their ascent. And they had actually a tremendous amount of conflict and settler death in this period. And so we can imagine Roanoke colony disappears at this point, and I'm going to give you a bit of a timeline. We have Jamestown established, and we have here, if this were a little bit bigger, we have this, and growing up in Virginia and taking about 5 years straight of Virginia colonial history, this is the fort itself. And if you grew up in Virginia, you've probably made one of these forts out of toothpicks or popsicles. I wasn't mature enough to handle toothpicks, so they gave me the popsicles to build this, right? But you have this lands in a chiefdom of Powhatan, right? Which is, if you can see him on the far upper right looming over it. And this was a rather powerful group and conglomeration of political allies here. And I don't want to get too much into it. There's lots of great things that are written, but encroachment on indigenous lands around resources and procurement, given there's a lot of instability in this area, a lot of droughts, initiates what they call the First Powhatan War. And in it, in 1609, 60 of maybe the 120 settlers are killed in a raid, right? Half of the early settlement dies in this war. By 1610, these are the starving period, right, where 85% of settlers die. There's always these accusations against native peoples about cannibalism. We don't have a lot of that, but we actually do have evidence of cannibalism among the Jamestown colony during this period. Right? We have, in a certain sense, by 1614, in a certain sense, our first treaty, if you will. And Pocahontas herself, which I'm sure everyone's familiar with, acts as a certain kind of treaty in her marriage to a colonial elite to try to end this war. And so we think of her, as a leader, figure, but also as a certain kind of institutional treaty here to try to avoid conflict. And the way in which Europeans would marry elite to elite to avoid conflict or reduce an ongoing war. We have the Second Powhatan War around this 10-year period, and there's this famous inscription here, I think a wood carving, and this is added color later on, about the attack on the settlers, the colonists in this period, right? The Indian Massacre of 1622. And as a result, 1/3 of the colony is killed, I believe, in that attack. We get a peace treaty that's signed in 1632 to try to avoid and end these wars. But by 1638, the settler population is much larger than the Powhatan Confederacy. And as a result, the Third War, that they're in a much better position. You only have 5% of the settlers who are killed. And treaties are signed and establish kind of boundaries at this point. And treaties later on become an institution, a convenience to try to reduce conflict. But we see other regions having a great deal of conflict as well. I'm going to leave the Virginia example and go to Australia in a second here. But we think about King Philip's War, incredibly devastating to the settlers in that area. Right? Now, in terms of thinking about comparisons with the Australian colonies, the first colony coming out of Sydneytown, and when we think about there's a lot of difference here as well. One is that it's a penal colony, which makes a difference regarding trade, and I'll explain how this affects the ability to extract settler death from indigenous populations. Right? We have 1,300 colonists. We have about 700 convicts, 300 others. And in the first 18 years or so of this settlement, there are 18 colonists who are killed by the Eora peoples who are in the Sydney Bay or that basin. Right, there may be a little bit more, but it's not quite the same numbers as elsewhere. Governor Phillip, who's the first kind of chief administrator of what would become Australia, or New South Wales, in comparison, he hangs 22 offenders, right? So the state authority over its own population might be more dangerous in a certain sense than those of the Eora Nation. And if we look at the New South Wales colony, we have James Cook, who comes by, describes things in terms of terra nullius, no man's land, but it's not official policy. First Fleet, which was actually supposed to go to North America, but the revolution derailed that. And then we have in the first 3 years of colonization, we've got really eight settlers that were killed. And you have the first kind of conflict between indigenous Australians in a more formal sense is the Nepean War, it should not be war, but that the largest battle in this is the Battle of Parramatta. Right, where there are 100 indigenous warriors, half are killed, 1 British soldier injured. Now, this is the largest, I think, documented battle between settlers, colonists, and indigenous populations. You have here as well probably the most dangerous place for settlers, which was the Tasmania and the Black War. And I'd actually recommend our keynotes article on the history of this genocide and how this war and this conflict spiraled, a really excellent piece. And in this particular period, in this Black War, you have 12 years, it's about 200 settlers are killed. But by 1835, there's a declaration by the governor at the time that terra nullius exists, and that's a type of category of law. Stuart Banner at UCLA has written a lot about this if you're interested, but that actually property rights did not extend and ownership did not extend to indigenous Australians. So it forecloses a lot of the possibility. Now, in terms of, if we look at this kind of early 17 years after colonization, we can see Sydney versus Jamestown, and we can see settler death in terms of percentages. And we see actually a big difference here. And we can think about actually a lot of the kind of causes of this variation. And Indigenous Australians were at a great disadvantage. There were no outside powers to play off each other. So France and Spain, indigenous populations in the US could say, well, we're going to actually treat with them. They have no access to firearms, so an excellent book on thundersticks I'd recommend. There's a penal colony, and there's a population loss that's maybe a little bit larger, though hard to know, and it's also a sea-focused colony at the time. I recommend as well a kind of a nice book on conflict norms. So you can see that at the first ideas that, wait, maybe Indigenous Australians did not fight hard enough for their land to make this happen, to bring out treaties. But in a certain sense, there was a lot of very important disadvantage early on that kind of made this inability to kill settlers really pronounced. So there are some limitations, of course, to what I'm talking about here today. So one is that this is a restricted, sample. We can think about New Zealand or Canada or South Africa as well as a possible example. Treaties are very complex institutions. They don't solve all of your problems, but I think ultimately they are quite important for establishing this relationship. There are other kind of cultural factors as well. So people have made the case that being colonized by a penal colony, in essence, or starting it off that way has a particularly aggressive feature and disrespectful feature. But I think overall, there does a few things that are worthwhile. I think you can at least say that there are clear differences in this violence early on, and that it also helps us to account for some of the major institutional differences between these two regions. Anyhow, thank you very much for your time today.
And now we'll open it up for questions. We'll do the Q&A. We'll do the Q&A after each presentation. And so we have 15 minutes. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to raise your hand and we'll get you a microphone.
Is it Catherine?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, thank you for that. That's really great. So how do you see treaties in relation to actually acknowledging sovereign Indigenous lands? Is it a stepping stone, thinking like of the Niska in Canada? How do you see that relationship?
That's a great question. So the idea is like what time period, right? So, I mean, treaties do something where they acknowledge a few things that are really important, right, from the set that people exist. And it's not that Indigenous peoples need to know that actually they exist for something to be meaningful, but it puts at the highest level for the settler state documentation that they're there and they have this relationship perhaps with this land. And I don't want to speak too much in terms of a broad brush here, but if you go to Australia, there's a lot of time spent saying that we exist and we exist over this land. So treaties themselves don't grant authority, right? That they are signifiers of a pre-existing authority. And it becomes a bit tricky, and I don't want to do the Australian case a bit of an unfair kind of assessment here, but that when you start talking about title and ownership, it takes until 1992 for there even to be a real recognition that Native peoples could have title, called native title, in the Mabo decision in '92. And this really changes things about whether or not how the state should proceed. So that's one aspect that treaties do. They acknowledge this existing. And so when you look at the US treaties with Native tribes, they're housed in the Library of Congress right next to treaties with Italy. So there's actually a relationship ideally between equals. And one of the, and I don't want to grandstand here too much on this one question, but there's one aspect whereby Indigenous Australians are in the process of trying to elicit treaty making from federal and state governments. And one aspect that's worth considering is that there's a lot of movement at the state government level. But now signing a treaty with the state government actually perhaps means there's an equality with the state government rather than an equality with the federal government, and whether or not they want to proceed, or even local municipalities, do they want to sign treaties? And now there might be something in the way in which the Australian constitutional system is set up, and my peers there would talk about this, that it may not be as big of a deal. But you want to be careful who you're treating with in terms of equality and how people might see you. Does that answer your question to a certain degree? Yeah. Thank you.
Hello. I have a question, but also a few statements. And I guess in regards to some of your last points, I think locationality and relationship to neighbors plays a huge role in terms of being autonomous and continuing to fight for sovereignty. I think something that is easily forgotten about in terms of, again, locationality, the southern point of Argentina and what it looks like for indigenous people below the hemisphere to engage across waters. I think for Turtle Island, some of our fights have been successful because we have banded together and we've created these confederacies. And I think in other locations, that type of conversation and modality of friendship isn't necessarily discussed all of the time. But then I also want to bring up the fact that treaties for Turtle Island, we practiced treaties before the settlers were here, before colonizers were here. We were treaty people before Euros, and we remain treaty people well before them. So I think the treaty relationship, a part of why that could be difficult for, family across waters and below the hemisphere is because that might not be a part of their epistemological belief, their Weltanschauung, their pedagogy, possibly. And so what does that mean to be introducing that? I'm definitely on the mental camp for Turtle Island that we don't need treaties honored, we need new ones, because the land is dead that those treaties identified. The mountain ranges that were identified don't exist. So what does it mean to fight for dead land that's also described as once being living in legal documents? My question, though, is, I guess kind of with regards to Darwin and colloquially the saying of the survival of the fittest, how do you feel that might play with regards to some of the mortality rates that you showed? Are settlers then not the fittest?
Those are all great questions slash points, right? Yeah, it's very, it's very hard to account or know how to account for distance, right? And one of the things, and I think it's quite a stunning book about Australia, is a book called The Tyranny of Distance, and about how what really defines it is the proximity and the remoteness of itself to its colonial origins, but also between cities, right? And I've forgotten the name. I think maybe Stewart was the last name about it. We'd be happy to get you a citation later. And I think that if we think about actually our keynote address, Professor Madley's work in the sense of, he mentioned this idea of moving people and removing people from their idea at the greatest possible distance to isolate them, right? And what that might have in terms of particular effects. And you think about this being amplified in the Tasmanian experience, right? That is not only in what they used to call the Antipodes, but also the furthest, most remote, most brutal penal situation in the farthest part of British Empire, perhaps. So I think that has a lot to do with it. And you could also make some cases that, well, what if, it were not Jamestown, but actually the British tried to settle in a much more remote place. Well, perhaps they would have developed institutions that did not include treaties because it wasn't as dangerous as well. So I don't know if that necessarily gets to some of your points, but I think accounting for that difference and that distance is really, really, really key. But it's hard to know how to do that. Now, in terms of whether or not Indigenous peoples were accustomed to signing treaties or not in Australia, it's going to vary, but there are agreements that people have with each other in terms of who is where when, right? So it's not a foreign concept from them. And there was an attempt by Batman who was a somewhat, well, it's hard to describe the story, but try to kind of create a treaty with Wurundjeri and people near Melbourne, but it didn't work out because he wasn't he was not an official representative of the Crown, but they are familiar with these types of exchanges as well. Now, one of the legal reasons that are justifications for why you don't get treaties is perhaps that British would, and you can see this in some of the journals of Joseph Banks, about Indigenous Australians are so quote unquote backwards that they wouldn't even think to sign a treaty because they couldn't identify who was the head of a particular group. And that is probably accurate in terms of the perception that British settlers and colonists have early on. But it's not that people came to Virginia or what would become Virginia and started signing treaties because they thought actually, oh, here's a sophisticated enough group to sign treaties. They're only doing it really as a result of existential threat. And that's what provokes it. So I think that, that is a template I imagine that people were using back then. Yeah. So thank you for a great question or series of questions.
Thank you very much. One of your the Australian example, there is one kind of difference between Tasmania and the mainland. And Tasmania was much more, I mean, there was a higher loss of settlers, right there. And it resulted in a kind of clear-cut genocide in Tasmania. So I wonder, taking your model, there should have been treaties because of the higher mortality rate. But is it not maybe also a factor of time? Because if you look to the comparison, as an historian, I have to ask about time. The kind of 1585 is very different from 1832 in, let's say, Australia or Tasmania. So I'm wondering, it's much more comparable to California, for example. Yeah. So I'm wondering, how do you kind of take time into account?
Well, let me go in reverse. And there is a big difference in terms of the technologies of colonization, right? But thankfully, for both the Maori and my point, is the Treaty of Waitangi came after all of this, right? So there was still an effort to sign treaties and was still on the table. Now, part of that was that there needed to be allies between, well, there's a lot of reasons for why that treaty was signed. Allies that they needed that were Maori to go help go south and colonize and take it over as well, right? Maori also had access to shotguns and other things that they had gotten from whalers. So we still do see treaties, so it is a good point. Secondly, the closest you get, so if you go to the journals of Governor Arthur, which is different than Arthur Phillip, Governor Arthur in Tasmania, he says that at the end of, I think, this conflict and war, it's like, wow, I really wish that we had tried to sign treaties, that it was as close as they came. But it was someone acknowledging that it may have been better if they had signed things both for their own efforts, but then I don't know about in terms of the future of Indigenous politics, absolutely not. So you do get that kind of, though you're looking at about 200, maybe 300 people out of 20,000, which I think is about the population in 1830. They don't quote me on that. That's, but we're looking at like 1-2% death as opposed to maybe 80 or 70 or 50. So those are really big in terms of differences of numbers, right? But the terror that you see is rather significant on the Tasmanian colonist side. But it's a great question. We've got some.
Good morning. Thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Orr. That was fantastic. About a year ago, I think, on Native Twitter, people went crazy talking about Jared Diamond and how annoying he is, especially when our undergrads have read some Jared Diamond, or not necessarily read him, just, know a bullet point of Jared Diamond. Would you care to elaborate on that, on why we don't get excited when our undergrads want to reiterate Jared Diamond, and why it can go in the wrong direction so easily?
Yes, so I choose his work because it is the best general example, and I don't mean necessarily best in the sense of accurate, right? So I cite things that I do not endorse, I show things that I do not endorse, right? But this idea that everybody, if they have not read the book, at least has access to seeing about that weird kind of way in which there's a progression of history through, genocide. There's no agency among indigenous peoples, right? But what I'm actually trying to show here is that when given the chance, there is actually a great deal of agency, right? That the institutions we think of as being critical for indigenous people, if the conditions were right, were within their hands to necessarily kind of either create or bring into being. And we can think about it in terms of what's important for the U.S. in terms of political development. We see Native peoples and the resistance from Native peoples creating institutions that are outside of necessarily ones that are important to them, but it's critical to the entire thing. So the regulation of trade on the interior, Absolutely. Maybe even the American independence, right? With the Royal Proclamation line as being one in which colonists wanted to move across it, and that being fodder as much as perhaps slavery for the Revolutionary War. We think about the St. Clair's defeat, a great book by Calloway, right? On how the defeat at the hands of indigenous peoples in the Ohio River Valley, if I've got that correctly, initiated the first cabinet meeting in the U.S., but then also said no more militia. There needs to be a standing army. Right? That's exceptionally important in terms of what creates the capacity, perhaps, for the centralized state of the U.S. Now, you could push it a little bit further if you wanted to say that some of the federation in Australia and the domination of the states in terms of the Australian system might be a result of the inability of indigenous peoples to resist and then have to make centralized authority. That's, I think, a bit strong, but there could be a case that's made there. But yes, not asking everyone to go out and read Jair Diamond, but you should be familiar with this idea in which how the popularized account of that. But thank you for that question. Yeah, that's great.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Orr.